recorded so that way we can include it in our archives for future viewing, as we always have people who are interested in circling back or challenged with time zones and can't make it today. So before we get started, just some general housekeeping. You will note that you can enter Q&A or chat at any time during the presentation, but for sake of the flow of our discussion today, we are going to hold all of those questions to the end. We are going to have plenty of time for that, so please feel free to drop your comment or question in at any time so that way you don't forget it, but know that we aren't ignoring you. We are just holding that towards the end of the discussion today. Quickly before I introduce Sharleen, I also just want to point out that we have included one additional webinar in our mental health series this year. This discussion was going to be the final one of the series, but we had such an overwhelming response to the QPR training that Dr. Kiefner out of USD provided, I believe it was in July. That we are going to host it again. She has kindly offered to do that for us on November 14th. QPR training is suicide prevention training. It's often referred to as the CPR for suicide prevention. It is an official training program. You will receive a certificate at the end of the program should you stay on for the entire course. It can run between 90 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the amount of questions. It is also limited to 35 people. So if this is something that interests you or any of your colleagues, I highly recommend signing up as soon as possible. So before we get started, I would love to introduce to you Sharleen Jahner. Sharleen is currently in a leadership role with quality and safety, staff safety, and with the Saskatchewan Health Authority. She has practiced in a variety of urban, rural, and remote northern communities in Western Canada, and in her early career held frontline nursing roles to include ER, medicine, ICU, OR recovery, and various community positions. Sharleen moved into management and has since held a variety of leadership roles at both regional and provincial levels. She has experience in utilization, evaluation, coordination, programming, project lead, education, and population and public health, including work with the First Nations Inuit Health Branch, Northern Health Intertribal Health Authority, Public Health Agency of Canada, and Ministry of Justice Coroner's Branch. Sharleen completed her master's in nursing in 2013 with a focus on nursing leadership and succession planning, and completed her PhD in nursing in 2020 with a research focus on psychological impact of trauma on nurses in rural settings. Through her academics, Sharleen has had the opportunity to work on a variety of projects, including the Nurse Practice in Rural Remote Canada 2 study, experiences of rural remote nurses with disasters, rural nursing mentorship, and rural nurse and the scope of practice. She has also had the opportunity to work on rural remote nursing national documents that include updating a national report, the Rural and Remote Nursing Practice Parameter Report, discussion and document, and development of the National Rural and Remote Nursing Framework, Knowing the Rural Community Framework for Rural and Remote Nurses in Canada. Sharleen is published in rural nursing journals, articles nationally and internationally, and has been an executive member of the Canadian Rural and Remote Nurses Organization for over 10 years. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Sharleen as she presents psychologically traumatic experiences of rural registered nurses who live and work in the same community. Thank you, Sharleen. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Stacy. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, just make sure I've got everything running here.
Looks great.
Thank you. I think it's working smoothly. So thank you, everyone, for joining from wherever you're currently residing and whatever time zone you're in the country or area you're at. I just want to thank GRNEN leadership team and Stacy for the opportunity just to share my research today and talk a little bit about something I'm very passionate about. My interest in this topic stemmed from my own past traumatic experiences as a rural and remote nurse years ago. And I moved back and forth at the time into urban centers and then migrated back into rural as a result of my husband's transfers. So in that process, I not only witnessed firsthand sort of the negative reactions in colleagues from traumatic events, friends that were nurses, just the overall impact of exposure and how they dealt with traumatic events in the environment that we were all working. So I have firsthand understanding of the complexities and challenges unique to rural nurses and remote nurses and the disparities with urban centers. So that is really the fundamental reason, the importance of pursuing a PhD in this area and its application. So just to give you a context, Saskatchewan is the central green area in the country. It is about 760 miles from north to south, or what would be 1,200 roughly kilometers, and 300 and almost 400 miles across, or 630 kilometers east to west. According to Stats Canada last year, 2022, the rural population in Canada was 18.25%. A 1.29 increase from the previous year, and there has been a gradual increase consistently year to year with the rural population. Today, I'll really touch base briefly on my integrated review and the framework I used, but I'm going to be focusing, just in the interest of time, on my research. Initially, I wasn't going to talk about the integrated review, but I think it's relevant to understanding how I got to where I am at the end of this research. So the integrated review, I started out with the objective was to explore the evidence related to potential negative psychological impact of caring for those exposed to traumatic events in rural nursing practice. There's a variety of options in terms of doing a literature review. The scoping review is really quite broad, and it looks at what's been done in the research to date, and really the types and sources of evidence. A systematic review is really summarizing the existing clinical research on a topic. And then it's more focused. So it systematically searches for and appraises and combines research evidence. Meta-analysis, they're pooled results of both qualitative studies that use statistical methods, often look at effectiveness of interventions and so forth and impact, but not all topics have sufficient research evidence to allow a meta-analysis to be conducted. So in that case, the integrative review was chosen as the appropriate strategy. And so the benefits of having an integrated review in this case was there wasn't a lot of research in this area. I had done a preliminary review. It is a systematic process. It uses it integrates a number of methodologies. It's comprehensive, so both qualitative and quantitative. Hence, it's the reason it's called integrative. It incorporates experimental and non-experimental studies and all studies that address any kind of related or identical hypothesis. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the framework I chose. So I chose the framework by Whittemore and Naffel. I'm just going to skip through this because it will take a little bit more time than we have today, but essentially it identifies a problem, which for me was the rural nurses out there are dealing with higher rates of traumatic injuries and death related to the environment than any other nurses based on the data or the evidence that I was able to review. And then I moved on to what would define a traumatic event. So based on a number of definitions of traumatic event, I really focused on using the one we have here in Canada. So our Health Canada term for, or definition for traumatic event is any extreme event that may occur in any location or form in which a person is subject to or witnesses or falls outside of the range of normal experience, is life-threatening, or could result in a series of injuries. And it exposes a person to shocking scenes of death or injuries, and or could lead a person to experience intense fear, helplessness, horror, or other reactions or distress. I felt it was quite fitting And that was my ultimate decision to utilize that definition throughout the rest of my research. So throughout the identification phase, using the framework, there's the problem identification stage, and in this case, rural and remote nursing is really one of the most high-risk occupations. It's in sparsely populated areas, and it has higher mortality rates of traumatic injury and death as a result of diverse farming accidents, motor vehicle accidents, delays in response time and instant recovery, recreation, environment, and rural occupations. Everything from ranching to mining, and just general farming and moving of equipment. It's an occupation that lends itself to high risk injuries and response to those injuries. So RNs working in rural are obviously working in an isolated area with that's minimally populated and geographically remote. They have limited support. They deal with trauma and injury and death as part of their role. There's a diverse range of healthcare services that are provided and the expectation upon them to provide those services, and to a complex grouping of patients through their entire lifespan. So from birth to death, meaning everything from infants, childbirth, dementia, cancer, and everything in between. Personal and professional boundaries are often blurred, and they often have dual and overlapping relationships in both professional relationships and community relationships with individuals that are friends and family. So they work and live in the same community with overlapping relationships, formal and informal social networks within the community. They're more likely to be intimately involved when they're dealing with traumatic events with someone that they know, and provide care for those suffering, often that they know quite well. As a result, they may just generally be at risk from a negative, transformative, or permanent psychological or physical injury as a result. So the integrated review outlined 4 key research questions, which I've outlined here: the terms used to describe the impact of exposure to traumatic events, the potential occupational outcomes, and what type of events the rural remote nurses are being exposed to and which have the greatest impact, and then what factors are not being examined or explored in the literature. I just put a snapshot here of this search strategy. It's not visible really to any of you. It's quite small, but it was the best I could do to give you a general sense of how that worked. And this particular strategy or document is in the publication if you do want to see how that looks in detail. So the keywords or key search terms that were used were rural and remote, obviously nurses, post-secondary stress disorders, secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. The articles looked at or explored were from 2016 to 2017 at the time. It was my early on in my first year of the research. We looked at, I had a librarian assist me to ensure that I wasn't missing any key terms, looked at the main concepts, major subject headings, did a keyword search category review on all alternatives for other language and terminology used, and then obviously used the or and combining them with just to obtain a more comprehensive search, and then use that against any trauma-related major subject headings. An exhaustive search provided these categories, and they were harvested from articles in different phrase searches, pairs. I used truncation, anything that I could use to identify any other suffixes that were used anywhere else around the world. There's different language that's used in different areas. And then it also varied between professions. So whether social work, mental health services, fire, police, different sources of literature use different types of language. I just put a snapshot here of what was included and excluded, and the total number of articles in the end. 9 were focused, subsequently were chosen. They focused on what I was looking for that addressed the gap in the knowledge on this topic. To give you a general sense, you can see that they were either, what was excluded where they were non-empirical, they were unpublished, had an urban focus, weak research design, weren't published in English, population was not of focus, research area not relevant. Nurse was not clearly differentiated. They were maybe newsletters or editorials or just in general for quality. The data evaluation stage looked at the overall quality of each article in the end, and used the critique process by Lucille and McGrath that was used to systematically evaluate the 9 articles that were chosen. So I looked at the substantive theory, substantive and theoretical directions, methodology, interpretation of the findings, and the presentation, and overall the strengths, merit, contribution to understanding, and ensure that it aligned with the purpose of the study. Just wanted to put a snapshot of a piece of the data analysis that was conducted and how it was laid out in the article. And then interpreting the findings. So there were 4 questions. So the first question was the terms that were used, as I indicated before, and I've outlined here some examples of the types of terms that were used. And then the variety that was identified was quite diverse. There was a lack of consistency, clarity was not there, conceptual terms and definitions and so forth. So quite an extensive, exhaustive process. Then on the second research question, I was able to identify potential occupational outcomes of those experiencing traumatic events. And I've outlined them here: workplace stress, psychological stress, internal turmoil, etc. Overall, the workplace psychological stress was identified as hazardous, and some work processes were identified as unsafe, impractical, unsustainable, and safety concerns were linked to psychological distress. It was quite clear. In addition, geographical challenges in those work settings, like travel distance, personal professional isolation, inconsistent cellular access, and communication issues. And the third research question was the types of traumatic experiences or events and which had the greatest impact. Really, there was a lack of evidence, but all characterized characterized by intense emotional feelings. And we need to just drill down and to get more conceptual clarity to capture some of those unique experiences that they were having, those intense feelings and experiences. The other was we were able to identify that factors not being addressed in the literature were really about settings. So they weren't really defining rural in consistent ways or within the rural context. One study referred to psychological impact of exposure to trauma in the rural environment. One study focused on trauma in remote. One study highlighted trauma in a circumpolar isolated area. So it was complicated. And then the rural urban context really was not clear. So we determined that the variety of terms used to discuss the geographical context really needed to be, how do I put it? It wasn't clearly defined, and we needed to drill down a little bit further. So overall, the study highlighted concerns with those definitions: rural, remote, and isolated areas, the greatest risk working in isolated and rural communities, lack of evidence related to the distress experienced, and potential negative impact on nurses, comprising many various terminology of diagnosis like PTSD and VT, vicarious trauma, and just impact over time. That was one of the things that was flushed out of this research, the literature research. Let me here, I'm just going to get onto this other screen. So none of the literature, though, focused specifically on rural nurses exposed to traumatic events not one. Little research exists, that was clear. Definition, as I noted before, was lacking. And most of the research was conducted in countries other than North America, which I found quite surprising. The terms were diverse, and really it really fleshed out the gap and the lack of research on this topic, focusing on nurses in rural and remote settings. So the occupational health and safety implications really it identified or highlighted the need for some management strategies. It looked at the lack of available support, or it fleshed out the lack of available support. And it also identified some compounding job demands and responsibilities. And some of the articles it identified those were being quite significant. And then in the end, it really fleshed out that further research was necessary, which was the basis of my PhD. It was an area that I had an assumption or some ideas that maybe I was on the right track, and this research or this literature review, integrative review, I flushed that out. So the next step was then to move forward with the next step of the research. So I moved forward with, really looking at what had been learned to this point before I moved forward to do the proposal and make some next steps, decisions on next steps. So we already know that the nursing profession is demanding and unpredictable. Nurses are exposed to psychological and physical injuries and impact. And rural nursing presents unique challenges. So dealing with trauma and death is a given. And it really is an area that we need to start thinking about moving forward and doing something about. In addition, the interrelationships in the community are quite substantial and quite impacting. So the research question for this next phase was, what social processes influence how RNs deal with exposure to distressing traumatic events in the context of working in the same rural agricultural community over time? So those nurses that live and work in the same community, they're embedded in the community, they're farmers' wives, they're business owners, they've gone out there as maybe a student nurse and landed a full-time job, or they've got friendships or relationships in the community. So this research question guided the overall study. The aims of the study were to describe those events experience, the distressing events experience, develop a reflexive understanding of the psychological impact of exposure, and then in that, having some experience in this work or this area, recognizing that I needed to examine my own feelings and reactions as I was moving through the research, and just understanding my motivations and recognizing that that needs to be built into the bias of the research. So throughout the research, ensuring that I was conscious of my reflexive understanding and not influencing the findings or assumptions that I may have had prior to this research. And then construct a substantive theory focusing on the distressing events in the context of rural nursing practice. The methodology I chose was constructivist grounded theory. Constructivist grounded theory was the most ideal choice for investigating a phenomena where little is known. It was the most appropriate to answer my specific research question and to develop a understanding of the social processes of how RNs deal with exposure to distressing traumatic events in the social context. So in constructivist grounded theory, the researcher must be familiar with the setting and the events under study. So that aligned well with me. I have experiences living and working in a geographical setting and been involved in those types of events. Therefore, I was in tune to the social context and that environment and the nurses live and work. The inclusion criteria, you'll see here, they had to have licensure in our province. So the Saskatchewan Registered Nurses Association, provide direct care and rural acute care facilities within the past year. And we talked about that piece for individuals that maybe have been on mat leave and so forth. We wanted to make sure that if this research was being conducted, it was with the most current experiences of nurses. It would be fresh with in the interview with the interviews and not providing historical, unless they brought it up, but through that interview process, which they did, but really trying to focus on those individuals with the most current experiences and put some timelines on it to give us a better sense. Full-time or part-time, not casual, because nurses often work in a variety of locations, and I really was focusing on acute care, not community. So if they worked in community services, for example, and acute care, they would have been excluded. Like in the rural community where they, or live in the community where they practice, so they're not doing contract nursing from another province or another country, current or recent experience in the rural nursing practice, and spoke English fluently. The geographical setting was West Central Saskatchewan, which is quite large, as you saw in the map. I have not identified, but there were 6 in this geographical area, 6 sites that were chosen, all small rural hospitals, acute care hospitals. Sampling was purposeful, theoretical sampling. In the end, there were 19 practicing RNs. There was, going back to theoretical sampling, it helped, I know that's probably a question some may ask, but it was an approach that would help guide me where I needed to go with the research and with the questions and where to focus on next early in the data collection process. I would be able to compare them more focused, compare data and drill down to have more focused, compare more focused data on the existing data that I had previous. So keep building on previous data. It would help identify some gaps as well as I was moving along through the research or the interview process. And it would also help identify some variations as I was moving through that work. But as the study progressed and more details and more of the observations from the nurses and their experiences, either recent or historical, as that started to emerge and become fleshed out, the theoretical direction became much clearer, and the original interview guide was actually modified and refined just to conduct some further interviews to provide some clarity on the relationships. And we focused on what was most relevant to what it appeared the nurses were indicating. So the questions and answers were helped direct the interview guide and where the data, what data would be obtained and drilled down a little bit further. Theory was generated by coding and analyzing. So data was gathered and compared, and then data was compared with data, and then codes were compared with coding, codes and coding was compared with categories, and categories were compared with categories. So what that means is, as data was developed or identified, it was refined, it was grouped, and then it was compared to other groups. It was refined and then grouped again. That's essentially the long short of it. It was really a way to narrow down the theoretical information that was coming through. A second group of interviews were conducted, and looking for more contrast, drilling down a little bit more, focusing on refining the tentative categories that had been fleshed out, looking at the sub-processes and theory that was developing, and then just getting to a point where there was theoretical saturation, when no new data was coming out after repetitive interviews, the same information was being identified and validating the theory. So as I said, the initial coding assisted to define what's going on, and then helped understand what it means. The focus coding helped with identifying the most categories, and then theoretical coding really outlined the relationship between those categories, the meanings, the processes, and the consequences. With Sharmaz's work or approach, she identifies 4 criteria to ensure trustworthiness of data, and I attended to those through the data collection and analysis process. So to attain credibility in that kind of interview process, it was based on my shared experiences as a researcher, and therefore I had reciprocity with the participants. And for nurses, it created a sense of comfort and familiarity and trust and authenticity. So they were quite open in the interview process. It was further supported by in-depth information that was gathered through the second interview and journaling by the interview participants, field notes and memos of my own experiences, and then using the participants' own words. The originality was ensured by examining an area that was never examined before and gaining insight and a broader understanding. And resonance was achieved by receiving verbal validation from the nurses that I interviewed about the importance of this work, the meaning to them that someone was listening, someone cared, and someone heard. And that following up with those interviews, that they were recognized as I was hearing and validating at the second interview point that what they were saying was in fact what I heard. And then usefulness, it was achieved by providing really practice recommendations in my discussion and strategies designed to inform organizational, occupational health, and safety policy. So the main concern in this work was the fact that rural areas are interconnected with traumatic events for life. They can't leave. They're embedded in their communities. They're not moving. It's their home. It's where their children are being raised. It's where their children go to school. It's where they're embedded in activities and sports and the entire social context. The social process that was determined was the term staying strong. So nurses dealt with their main concerns through a social process of just staying strong. What I've done here in this next, let's try to put it up here, sorry. In this model is outline sort of the phase, if you will, of how nurses move through the process and we came up with the term staying strong. So the model represents how nurses deal with the exposure to any traumatic event. The orange circle around the outside is really the forelinking sub-process, as we call it, and it represents how nurses deal within the community that they live and work. So that circular community component of the work that they do, that social context. Inside, you'll see it includes the realities of the practice and the perceptions being embedded in the community. And for nurses, the socio-physiological, the socio-cultural and physical context, they're intertwined with it. And it was intertwined, they're deeply rooted with their personal connections and interrelationships. So I took a snippet for the first section here. You'll see so nurses rely on one another. That was one of the things that came out quite early on in the first early part of the interviews. They rely on one another. Externally, they support one another. They find strength in relying on the informal support of their peers. They're individuals that can relate to the impact. They also share with their families and friends where they also draw strength from, and they can, regroup and regain a sense of control of their feelings and continue on working in that environment. The second was seeking and sustaining strength internally. Nurses really try not to be consumed by the traumatic events by drawing on their inner strength and by seeking ways that they find most helpful. They search for what I call peace, comfort, and balance. Looked for healthy ways of coping, whether it was walking their dogs or driving around the block or the street or taking an extended drive down the road before they go to work or after, whatever worked for them, and relying on spiritual connections. They also process and deal with the turmoil in a way that they find suitable to their own, what fits for them, what works for them personally. And they try to regain a perspective and some kind of connection with the environment and nature seem to really be significant strength builder, if you will, and help them to take more time to process any events that they had experienced. The internal external processes occurred concurrently, though, which was interesting. It went back and forth, and that's how they made sense and dealt with what they were experiencing. Oops, sorry, here we go. So the third one, with me here, at the right screen. The third one was they also try to leave the past behind. So some of the sub-processes were in their control and some were out of their control. What was in their control was the attempt to contain or bury their emotions or suppress their painful memories. They figured things out on their own, and they just basically endured and forged ahead. They tried to maintain a positive outlook. They believed in themselves. They had enough self control and self-esteem that they believed that they were going to get through it. And they recognized the difficulty, though, in leaving the past behind and just made a decision to forge ahead. But they did strategize ways to avoid triggers and contain those emotions. It was something that they developed, but was out of their control was the emotional response that where they would spontaneously re-experience feelings or unwanted intrusive images and that sort of thing that would infiltrate their minds. So an example would be certain smells or visuals or sensory type things that triggered certain events that they weren't expecting or prepared for. I know one of the interviews talked about walking into the grocery store and something in the grocery store smelled like brain matter and they couldn't shop for groceries any longer, that kind of thing. So that kind of sensory impact. And then the fourth one was in experiencing permanent transformational change. So they really did undergo a fundamental shift. They started to expect and prepare for the worst and hope for the best in all situations. So that also tied in with taking time, driving to work, maybe driving on the block, sitting in their vehicle, going ahead of their scheduled time to work and waiting outside in the vehicle to psych themselves up, that kind of thing. They really learned to live with it and accepted the reality of the impact and the difficulty of leaving the past behind. Somehow, with that being said, they were able to restore a sense of hope and optimism and really find a new sense of self, is what I described. So, in the end, the study really revealed the socio-cultural and physical context being intertwined with the emerging theory. It revealed a deeply rooted personal connection and community interrelationship. The nurses have difficulty separating themselves entirely from the traumatic events that they've encountered, historical or recent, and the social context was a key process in staying strong in order for them to deal with the exposure to traumatic events. Staying strong was also central to them to deal with their fear and anticipation of subsequent and future traumatic events, which really contributed to their ability to cope. But the resilience and continuing, it helped to build the resilience and continue to provide safe patient care to patients and residents. It also revealed that current organizational processes and support processes are inadequate, inappropriate, inconsistent, or non-existent. Rural nurses are not receiving the support that they require, and the study just illuminated that fact that rural nurses rely on one another and primarily, and they deal with their anguish on their own. There's a lack of understanding of the severity of the traumatic impact, the short and long-term consequences, or how traumatic events influences nurses' ability to function, or how the cascade of events can place nurses and their patients at risk. So recommendations for future practice were really, there were 5 that were flushed out of the research. Developing a rural-focused organizational framework that protects and promotes psychological well-being of rural nurses. And I say that being specific to rural nurses, having a unique dynamic than urban nurses and what they have access to for immediate support. the integration and advancement of trauma-informed care principles into the existing organizational response at the clinical level, and increase knowledge and understanding and enhance safety, and improve the response and build capacity. Also to establish a formalized peer support program for nurses to assist rural frontline nurses who are vulnerable, and improve mental health support in rural settings using more innovative technologies. Also integrate and advance trauma-informed principles at all nursing programs to better equip frontline nurses with the knowledge and skills to deal with traumatic events at work, be able to appropriately support one another, and better protect themselves for future adversity. In conclusion, the research supports my original theory, assumptions, and theory, and what I've seen and experienced in rural nursing practice. What I was surprised about was the magnitude of suffering, and to find that many of them had never shared their experiences to anyone before my interview. That was a humbling experience for me and shocking at the same time. A lot of the nurses had never shared some of their stories with even their partner or their spouse. The research also illuminated what had not been seen in past research, and that the psychological impact of exposure to trauma on rural nurses is a concern. The study highlights the study insights provide a comprehensive understanding of the perspective from a rural nurse's lens and the mental health implications of trauma on those that live and work in the community that they practice. There's an opportunity here to build on the research and to test appropriate interventions such as a rapid response team, broader trauma-informed education, and trial formal peer training and support programs to determine the most effective ways to support nurses in rural practice settings. I just want to acknowledge, my academic supervisors was Dr. Kelly Pence and Dr. Norma Stewart, and the research was supported by a number of scholarships. I've identified the primary ones here, and since my research was done, Dr. Stewart has retired, so she's now in Emerita, but still out and about helping and supporting current rural nursing research newbies like me. So overall, I think research fleshed out a gap in an area that has been underestimated, and in a group of healthcare workers that have been underrepresented in the research. So the next steps, I won't get into the next steps here because I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask some questions. I know I went through this quite quickly, and I really wanted to give a bit of a context with the integrated review because it really was a ton of work that, when you're not finding literature, you have to really look at every crook and cranny and drill down as much as you can and expand and expand. But it was quite shocking that there really is no literature out there. And then the research process itself was quite cumbersome with the interviews, having done a couple of interviews and then journaling. So the data, there were hundreds of pages of interview data to work through. So rich information. The quotes that I compiled are heartbreaking. It was quite a unique research topic because there wasn't one interview that was conducted where there wasn't an emotional response on the part of the interviewee. It was an opportunity for them for the first time in, like I said earlier, in some cases to share, and for others that may have shared to expand, and to have somebody actually listen and care and perhaps maybe move forward with this was for them in all cases affirming in one way or another. So that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Charlene, for sharing that. It's quite moving work. Um, so we are going to open this up to questions now. Please feel free to use either the Q&A feature or your chat feature in the Zoom panel. We'll give it a couple of minutes. As we look through this, you can always feel free to reach out to us at info@grnen.org. I know a lot of times when we have these conversations, it's a lot to absorb. So we come back to it at a later date and we realize that we have something left unanswered. So you can always reach out to us and we can connect you with Sharleen. You can also, of course, go into the GRNEN website and visit our community and connect with her directly there. I have a comment from an individual who's listening saying, when I did my research on school nurses in a rural area, I also found that there is a dearth of literature and the nurses were grateful for a voice. I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, that's consistent. Just to have a voice. It's interesting that it has not been researched. Some things are researched to death. And I was told when I started my work early on, when I was conducting the integrative review, that I was sitting on a gold mine of research. And it has been it hasn't, there's no end to what can be done with this specific topic. But it's interesting that given the occupational health and safety legislation that's out there and organizations are required to be accountable legislatively, that there is not more attention placed on this particular topic. And more recently, the increase of violence and that we're seeing in most urban centers and in the access points like emergencies and ambulatory care areas, we're seeing more and more of that those situations are also happening in rural. And so if there's an increase in violence and substance abuse and that sort of thing in urban, it's happening in rural. They're dealing with that as well. And they don't have a physician caller on site, and they don't have somebody that they can just tap on the shoulder to come over and help them from down the hall or another unit if they run into a crisis. So it really is interesting how isolated that they are and the types of things that they're dealing with. And as we move forward with more equipment, larger, bigger, faster equipment and vehicular type things, we're seeing really significant traumas as well, and requirements for significant trauma care at that endpoint or entry point. And so they're dealing with quite graphic things, and that's everything from children being backed over to crushing injuries to motor vehicle accidents where there's alcohol involved and people are presenting to emergency in rural small town hospitals, in disarray and challenging one another as to who's at fault. And they're not social workers. They don't have security and they haven't got somebody to deal with those types of things. So really is an interesting dynamic of a lot of things that are happening societal wise and structurally with rural and remote nurses.
Well, thank you for that. So if there are no other questions at this time, again, we invite you. Oh, I was jumping the gun. We have another lovely comment. Thanks, Sharleen, for an interesting presentation and the implications for rural nursing practice sustainability. So thank you, Dana. So I will give that another moment because I don't want to cut anyone off. We do have a couple of minutes, which we can continue discussing, or we can return back to your day. Again, we look forward to hopefully seeing you later this year with the November QPR training. We are going to be posting information very soon for a short series coming in October. No, I'm sorry, that will be in November as well, where we're going to be sharing the heart of rural nursing in South Dakota, which will give a very unique perspective on an immersion learning experience that South Dakota nursing students were able to do in clinics throughout the state. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, Sharleen, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for the time that you took, for the research that you've conducted, and for your willingness to share that with us. We will be posting the recording of this on our website and the on-demand archive within the next few days. If you would like to revisit anything shared today, or if you would like to invite a colleague to view this wonderful presentation. Again, we look forward to seeing you online and in a future webinar. And I hope that you have a beautiful evening or morning or rest of your day, depending on where you're calling in from. So thank you. Thank you, Sharleen.
Thank you, Stacey.